significant. Obviously, the announcement by Novak that he has been granted a medical exemption, and that exemption affords him the opportunity to come into Australia, come into Victoria, and compete at the Australian Open. So he's currently on a flight on his way here, and gets here sometime today. I wouldn't mind just quickly going through again what we discussed this morning, a little bit on the process and how we've got to this point. We have been saying from the beginning that anyone coming into Australia or coming onto the grounds in the Melbourne Park precinct would have to be vaccinated or would have to have a medical exemption and approved by a medical practitioner or by a medical panel. And we set up, Tennis Australia set up the first panel, and that panel was designed, made of independent doctors, epidemiologists, was designed to assess any application that was received. They were blind applicants that were received. In other words, no one knew who the applicant was. That was reviewed and assessed and then passed on to the second panel, which was set up by the government for further assessment. That's not a process that the normal, an Australian coming home or anyone coming into Australia, that would not be the process. Simply they would have to apply directly to medical practitioners to have their name eventually added to the Australian Immunisation Register. And when that gets added, then you, for all intents and purposes, considered vaccinated, and you can get the green tick that all of us have as vaccinated individuals. There were 26 applicants through the process. There's a handful which were provided with an exemption, and that handful, that information only gets disclosed by those individuals on the grounds of which they will provide an exemption. That's personal, private, confidential medical information that we are not at liberty to share publicly. But it's very clear on the ATAGI guidelines, it's very clear on what conditions you would receive an exemption on. And to briefly, quickly summarize those, one of them is obviously having an adverse response to any kind of vaccine and having something like an anaphylactic response. Another one is if you've just had major surgery and may or may not be suffering from myocarditis. And another one is you're a recovered case. In other words, you've had evidence of COVID and certified evidence of COVID over the past 6 months. If you meet any of that criteria, then it's assessed by the medical team, and Dr. Broderick can provide some of that information, but it's assessed by the medical panel, both panels, and if it's granted, then you're given an exemption, and then that becomes communication between the applicant and the panel at that point. So the process has been very clear, and we completely understand and empathise with first of all, some people being upset about the fact that Novak has come in because of his statements over the past couple of years around vaccination. However, it's ultimately up to him to discuss with the public his condition if he chooses to do that and the reason why. He received an exemption. We as an event, also as a state and as a country, will do everything we possibly can to give everyone an equal and fair opportunity to come into the country. And if they come in and they come in through the guidelines that are set forth and the conditions of which they can compete, then they're granted with an exemption. The majority of players and the majority of people on site are vaccinated because, again, to come into the grounds, and all our patrons coming in, the critical workforce, the players coming in will have to show, through the QR code, will have to show through the services of the VIC, will have to show the green tick. And you also get that green tick if you're medically exempt. So we don't single out someone if they're medically exempt, and that applies not only to players, their support staff, and fans as well. And that's the right process. And we're confident with what we put forward, and in close partnership with the Victorian government. And tennis has gone above and beyond what would normally be required coming into the country. And coming into Victoria's and on the precinct. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Carla if there's anything else. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Craig, and good morning, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging what an incredibly challenging couple of years the Victorian community have been living through, and indeed, here we are again in a period that is somewhat anxiety-inducing and really challenging for people, as we've seen case numbers increasing with the Omicron variant. So I want to recognise and acknowledge that this outcome is something that many in the Victorian community will find frustrating and upsetting, but I want to make it absolutely clear that, as has been the case the whole time, no one is or will be receiving special treatment because of who they are or what they have achieved professionally. That our overarching imperative through the pandemic now for 2 and in relation to the hosting of all our big events, including, in this instance, the Australian Open, has been the safety of the Victorian community, the health and wellbeing of the Victorian community. And so for participants, whether they're players, the workforce, those attending to watch a great match, the overarching imperative here is to ensure the safety of all people. Now, Craig has provided with you some detail about how the process has worked, and so what Novak, his experience and that of a handful of other people who have applied through this process has demonstrated is the ability to satisfy not just the Commonwealth Government's requirements for entry, but something well above and beyond that. So for any Victorian resident, Victorian citizen who wants to go to the pub or in many cases go to work and needs to demonstrate their vaccination status and have that green tick that we're all so familiar with, they have to meet a very narrow set of criteria that are determined by ATAGI. That is what has happened in this case, but in relation to the panel process, this is vastly more robust again. So instead of going to a doctor that you know and that you perhaps know well and that knows you, the applicants have had their information redacted, so it's all de-identified. They're considered by not one doctor that you know, but 6 doctors that you don't. So I just want to provide people with an assurance that the imperative to keep participants in this event and spectators at this event and the workforce safe has always been utmost in our plans and preparations. We thank Tennis Australia for putting in place a more robust process than has existed for anybody else entering the country or participating in any of the other activities that we know and enjoy. And I look forward to a really successful tournament. We are the major events capital, and we have an amazing and exciting calendar, and we will continue with this program of events and keeping the economy open and enabling people to do the things that they've all earned and to enjoy them and to do so safely. And we will continue to hold that mantle of major events capital, and I hope everyone enjoys the tennis this summer. We're happy to answer any questions.
While you're in front, and just sorry, probably a bit of a deviation from what we'll end up asking Charlie, but is there any word yet on whether there'll be restrictions on visitors or audiences at the tennis?
The pandemic legislation outlines the process for decisions to be made by the Health Minister and the reasons to be provided publicly. As you all know, we now have an incredibly robust and transparent new legislative framework that is fit for purpose. So I'm not in a position to provide you with any update on that, but what I can indicate is that the Acting Premier will be addressing you all within about an hour, and so she'll be in a position to take questions on all of those issues of the day with the most contemporary information for you all.
We'd love to ask the Premier ourselves about this, but has someone spoken to the Premier? He was very outspoken December the 9th, very outspoken about this. How has he reacted? I can imagine he won't be pleased.
Sorry?
The Premier was very outspoken
I just
on
didn't hear the
December
last
the 9th. Yeah, I can imagine he wouldn't be particularly pleased by this.
Look, I won't presume to speak for the Premier. The Premier is having some leave, save and except for the fairly frequent National Cabinet meetings at the moment. The Deputy Premier, as I said, will be available. Look, I think lots of people in the Victorian community will find this to be a disappointing outcome, but the process is the process. Nobody has had special treatment. The process is incredibly robust. It's de-identified, and we are where we are. And so, the tennis can begin, and we'll have a terrific event. But I just want people to be confident. No special treatment. and a very, very robust process that above and all puts the Victorian community's health, safety and well-being
On a
first.
personal level, you've stood up so many times encouraging people to do the right thing and get their vaccination so they can, mingle, be out in public, enjoy everything that we've worked so hard to protect. Do you feel that sense of frustration that you're saying that many in the community would feel about this decision?
Well, because I have, taken, all of the short minutes it takes to read the ATAGI guidance on what constitutes an exemption, again today, ahead of seeing you, but previously in the context of small business reopening and all of those issues that we've been dealing with the business community, Victorians have done an extraordinary thing, and we're able to enjoy so many freedoms and things that seem so very, very distant when we think about the winter, 6 months ago, the really challenging winter of 2020 as well. Look, I'm really pleased that the tournament can go ahead. I'm really pleased that Victorians have responded so enthusiastically to the challenge to be vaccinated. We know there's a job now to get everyone who's eligible to take that third dose and to do so quickly. And we're also asking people to listen very carefully to the advice from our health minister, from our emergency services about what to do in the event of exposure, because of course there's a lot more of that than there was. I think overall I'm really, really happy that the event's going ahead, and this is, I think, this will be frustrating for people, but it is what it is in some respects. The process has been incredibly robust, and I have confidence in it. Oh, I'm sort of more a Rafa person, to be perfectly honest, and I'm like mad for Barty, so that's kind of where I'm going to be when I go to the tennis. This is not a process that exists for one person. There are 26 applicants. There are a handful, as I understand, that have been able to satisfy those ATAGI tests through that robust two-step process. So I think, it is what it is. Sort of hoping Rafa wins though. A handful. It's usually 5 in terms of an exact number. Perhaps Craig's able to help us with that.
We've seen, as part of vaccine mandates, people have lost jobs, people haven't been able to travel, people have given up so much. What do you say to those people that feel let down when they see a sports star fly straight in to compete and possibly win millions of dollars?
Well, the suggestion that a sports star's just flying in, I would reject. This particular sports star and the other handful of people who have satisfied this robust process have met tests above and beyond those that anybody else entering the country, or indeed when we had interstate border restrictions, were having to meet. There are less than a handful of circumstances where people can satisfy the criteria for a green tick, and in this case that has been satisfied. Novak isn't coming to play at the Australian Open because he's, the biggest tennis star of them all. He's coming because he has been able to demonstrate through this process that he has an eligibility under the rules that apply to everybody else in the country.
I don't realise before it set up the second panel, a new panel to look at exemptions, that Novak Djokovic was one of the people who applied for exemption, or did it become clear after the establishment of that panel that he applied for it?
So the process has been set up without reference to any particular individual, and I know you're all interested in one applicant over all the other applicants, but this process is going to be very helpful, I think, for our events going forward, and we have an amazing calendar of events, and so the Victorian panel will be able to be used in future, and the medical expertise that exists includes sports medicine, cardiology and immunology. And so, these are experts in their field. I know far more about these things than myself or any of our colleagues. Was I surprised that Novak was one of the people seeking to access this process, I guess not. And I don't know that anybody else much would be on.
How do you think the fans in Melbourne will react tonight?
I don't know. He's been an outspoken, has outspoken views about vaccination, which I think are not in great alignment with the overwhelming views of the Victorian community. I mean, people have made very clear their views on vaccination in Victoria and indeed around Australia by going and being vaccinated. And yes, some people have perhaps been hurried along, or some people have perhaps been encouraged to take that step because of the mandates. I think the mandates are an incredibly important link to keeping the economy open and for us to live with this virus. But I think that mandates will continue to play an incredibly important role for us all, for events and for daily life. But there have always been this handful of reasons that people can get their green tick, and that's best determined by medical experts. I don't know that the health orders go to things like posting selfies, and in terms of the crowd reaction, the sports going public are a wonderful group of people. Tennis crowds are very, very passionate, and I would encourage people to be respectful of all players and all participants. People are entitled to their views.
What?
He has the restrictions that apply to people who are eligible under that ATAGI list, the people who get a green tick that are unvaccinated or perhaps unvaccinated, they are deemed by that ATAGI process to be vaccinated for all intents and purposes. They have that exemption. There are some limits to things they can't do, so they can't enter into particularly high-risk settings like hospitals and I think aged care facilities. Again, I probably could perhaps come back to you with some more detail on that. I'm not as familiar with those arrangements and rules, but there are things that are permitted by anyone who has the green tick, and then there are some limits for people who have that exemption.
And what is the process?
Yeah, I believe so. I might have to take some further advice on that. Yeah.
So I think Craig said there's 26 people that applied. How many people were granted?
Yeah, a handful were granted exemptions of the 26. And the process, as Craig has outlined, is, I feel great confidence in the process, and because I thought I might have to stand up in forums like this and explain the process, but we spent a long time making sure that it was fair and rigorous, and appointing experts in the field of immunology, infectious diseases, general practice, and then with the government panel oversight as well. So there were two-stage process, and just directly following the ATAGI guidelines, which are not a lot of interpretation there. They're pretty straightforward, and particularly with the de-identified process, I think we felt confident that the panels didn't even know whether these people were players or whether they were other player support people or partners, or so they were totally de-identified when they were making their decisions based on that.
How can it be truly blind? Because surely things like age and health documents from country of origin have to be included. So if you know the age and you know the country of origin, you can put two and two together.
Country of origin was also redacted from the documents, and also where, except in places where age was important, age was also, date of birth was redacted as well.
Well, then how do you verify the documents?
Well, then that happens in the next step. So obviously, at some point, once the decisions have been made, then the official documents have to be reviewed that are identified so that we can put it in the AIR as well.
So they don't actually analyse the documents and whether they think they're genuine?
They look in terms of how any medical professional would look at the documents. I suppose they're not doing any sort of, intelligence sort of operation. It's really taken on the basis of how they would assess documents medical documents that are presented to them in Australia.
Part of that process, say for example, there's a doctor's note from a foreign country. Did anyone in Australia, either of those two panels, seek to discuss the matter with that practitioner?
No. But in some instances they requested additional information, but no, they didn't have direct contact with doctors from another country.
So, no due diligence on the veracity of the report. Not to say that there wasn't cases, but there was no due diligence done on whether any of the documents, on the status of documents.
I suppose these people are medical professionals. They assess the medical information.
But they could be anyone. No one in Australia can know who these people are.
Who the players or the practitioners? No, but they were chosen on the basis that they're experts in their field.
But in terms of the information, the documents they're getting, how do they know, in basic terms, how do they know they're fair dinkum if they haven't checked the source of them?
Yeah. Well, they were looking for official seals, obviously, in these documents from overseas. It wasn't just based on text message. In fact, some of the documents they're receiving from overseas are more, because in Australia you often just get that text message that tells you you're positive. These were actually formal laboratory reports.
Well, surely then the seals were going to have country of origin or something indicating where they came from.
Yeah, I can't really comment on that process. They weren't set up as an intelligence committee. They're a group of expert doctors.
What proportion of the total, and you might need to speak in ballpark terms, what proportion of exemptions sought were for people who had medical conditions versus others who may have had COVID in the last 6 months?
I can't comment on our group, but if you look at an Australian group of people applying for medical exemption, the vast majority are recent COVID. That's just, and particularly in an environment where Omicron is so prevalent, the vast majority are recent COVID. And
does that apply to the cohort of people that applied?
I can't comment on the actual applicants in our process, but that's just because that's private information.
Not individually,
yeah.
I just mean as a group.
Yeah, I would expect it would reflect the rest of the population.
Considering he's the best tennis player in the world, incredibly fit, is it fair to assume he's tested positive to COVID in the last 6 months? That's the only real explanation if he doesn't have a heart disease competing on the world tour.
Again, I can't comment on individual people that went through the process there.
I've said something to them. Now, I think you'll all understand why it's not appropriate for any member of the medical panel to comment on which of the reasons it is. Look, I'm sure that there will be opportunities where Novak will address the media, as he always does, and I would welcome him sharing that information that no one else can with the Victorian community, because there is a high level of interest. There's a deep and enduring connection between this event and this tennis player, and I would welcome him providing that information and providing that clarification to the Victorian community.
Do you think that would put a lot of people at ease if they understood exactly why he was granted the exemption? Those people that you say may feel frustrated, that could provide some explanation.
Look, I think a lot of people are jumping to the conclusion, and not correctly, but jumping to the conclusion of some kind of special deal or special treatment. Like, nothing could be further from the truth. And this is a massive international event, of great interest to our community here and people around the country, but the tennis loving community of the world. And look, I think that would be a good thing for him to do. I do. I think that would settle a lot of questions that people have in their mind, but it's not for anyone else to make that decision. But I am sure that you will have the opportunity to attend press conferences with Novak over coming weeks when he arrives and when he's training and then when he hits the courts, and I'm sure people will ask that question. But I would encourage him to the view that that's not an unreasonable thing for the Victorian community to have answered.
Ask Craig then.
So just one
Quick.
it's awful. It's really, really difficult. People around the world have had their lives turned upside down by restrictions, by the way in which governments around the world have had to manage the pandemic. As you know, our number one imperative from the get-go has been the safety of the Victorian community, and that has involved some incredibly difficult decisions. And people have done hard things. They've missed saying goodbye to loved ones, they've missed seeing loved ones. People have had their businesses profoundly impacted, their way of life, their incomes profoundly impacted. There aren't too many people in our community who have not been touched in a negative way by the pandemic. And so what I would say to people who've had those particularly challenging and sometimes tragic experiences, like, we understand your circumstances. I offer my deepest personal sympathies to people in that situation. And again, whilst today's news may be maddening to you, I want to reassure you that no one's had special treatment. The same rules apply to everyone, and our desire to make sure the Victorian community is as safe as it can possibly be while this event is impacting the whole world continues to be our absolute objective here. And I wish you nothing but peace and the best.
Minister, are you surprised that the medical panel didn't seek to confirm with international doctors and check that side of it?
Oh, look, I haven't got anything to add on that process. That's not something I've been personally involved in. The role of the government here has been to work with Tennis Australia to establish a very robust process, one that will be very useful for us for future events, but also for this event to provide the community with the assurance that they need, and also to make sure that the event can go on in a way that is safe for players, for all of their support crews, for everybody working on the grounds, and of course everybody attending.
Craig, you regularly talk with Novak because of his position with the players. Will you urge him to come out and publicly just explain very briefly in very broad terms, just to put the Victorian public, give them something given everything that's going on?
So I think it will certainly be helpful if Novak was to explain the conditions which he's sought an exemption and been granted an exemption. But ultimately, it's up to him, as both Dr. Broderick and Joel have explained, is that while you keep asking the question around under what conditions they're being granted the exemption, we're just not in a position, even legally not in a position, to disclose other people's medical information. It's ultimately up to him. And yep, I will encourage him to talk to the community about it, because it'll not only help him, but it'll help the community, because we have been through a very tough period over the past 2 years, and we would appreciate some answers to that.
But the principle of privacy is obviously sacrosanct with legal and ethical.
Yes.
But this very rare situation, you would know more than anyone that it's hard to lead up to the event. Public interest in this status is overwhelming.
Yep.
You want him to say it publicly. The government wants him to say it publicly.
Yep.
You talk to him regularly. Have you ever said to him, Novak, can I just say on your behalf what the issue is, because we've got a media storm here, or have you ever said to him, just say it publicly yourself, because this is a serious situation?
Look, I mean, I'm not going to disclose, again, the details of our private conversation, but we generally have encouraged him to do it, and we'll offer him any support that he needs to do that. Yep, yes, we have, and we absolutely. I mean, Novak constantly has said his medical condition and situation is private to him, and at any point that he decides to disclose that, he will. And we're not going to force anyone to do that, and that's going to be ultimately up to him. As I said previously, it would be helpful. And I think it's really important also to note is that we've got other questions to answer. Is that what happens when there's an individual, like in the case those that were provided with an exemption, that have a legitimate condition that comes under the ATAGI guidelines and want to come into Australia? How do we answer those people? It's the exact same way. There's a process that they would go through, and as Joel and Dr. Broderick pointed out, is that process for tennis players was far more rigorous than you would normally. So I think that's important to recognise that, and it's important to communicate to the Australian public is that this is not preferential treatment for anyone, even though it may feel that way. Novak? No, Novak is very simply, he's done what anyone would do when they're required to come into Australia. He's gone through the process, he's filled out the paperwork, he's submitted all the documentation, whatever the panel requested of him, I'm sure he's provided them, because that would have been a condition of which the panel would review it. And I know, I mean, our own medical team led by Dr. Broderick is the best in the world. It's recognised as the best in the world. And they are not going to do anything that's going to jeopardise the health and safety of any individuals, including the players. We're not going to do anything, and neither is the Victorian government. So while there's a high level of emotion right now immediately after this decision, and will be a lot of question around the process, the transparency of the process, the documentation, but the facts are, and we've just got to go on the facts, that there was a process put in place that went above and beyond what you would normally do coming to Australia, meeting the conditions of the target, and we'll continue to stand by that, because this is the beginning, and I think that's where there's a lot of difficulty here. We've got many events in Victoria. We're the events capital of the world. We're going to have this every week, and there's going to be groups of people that are legitimately can come into the country under those guidelines, and we're not going to not let them in. And there will be some profile stars and music stars and athletes, and there will not. So this is not the first time we're going to have this conversation. It just happens to be Novak. We would love, to your question, Novak to talk about it and help us with it, but ultimately it's going to be up to him. And certainly I'd encourage him to be as open, as honest as he possibly can, like we've been here today.
Like, there's a Russian female player who was vaccinated. He's got this fucking exemption. Not allowed in. He's doing it. Like coming in unvaccinated. Other players who may be vaccinated with unrecognised vaccine can't play.
Yeah, look, it's hard to answer a general question without knowing the conditions, but the conditions of coming into Australia are straightforward. If you're unvaccinated, you do 14 days of quarantine. We are unable to leave the room. So unvaccinated individuals come in. If you're vaccinated, you show your vaccination status and you can come in. If you are not vaccinated and you apply for a medical exemption because you have one of the conditions outlined by the federal government, then you can also come in and be considered the same as a vaccinated player. So any player that doesn't fit into those three categories, and actually in Victoria is even further, if you're unvaccinated and you do the 14 days of hard quarantine, you're not considered vaccinated, therefore you're not allowed on the precinct.
There was brilliant last year's tournament over the mention of vaccines. We've now got this really high-profile case of a player who's been fairly outspoken about vaccines in the past. Do you worry that the Australian Open is going to become a rallying point for anti-vaxxers or vaccine-hesitant Victorians?
I'm confident in not only people that come to the Australian Open, but in Victorians. We understand. We're going to go through a period of a lot of question and maybe dissatisfaction and disappointment about Novak being allowed in. But when we get to understand, and I encourage everyone to go to the website and have a look at the conditions of entry, and have a look how you come into the country, which applies to everyone, then have a look at what's put forward by the Victorian government and by tennis particularly on that process. I think over the time when people understand that, maybe to Novak's comments would be helpful, and people understand that, then I'm not expecting any of that, and we're just going to do the best we possibly can every single day.
Can you explain the process?
Last question.
Sorry, can you just quickly explain the process? What actually happens now when it comes to Australia? What does you have to do in terms of testing, any quarantine, anything like that?
Yeah, so anyone coming into Australia, and this is the other thing, this hasn't been disclosed that much, but currently the tennis players are doing daily rats, and that's so anyone that comes on site, including the critical workforce that interact with him. So anyone that's coming on site is doing a daily test. The supervised test takes place when they arrive, and then between day 5 and 7. Again, these are extra conditions that we're putting on the tennis players that are not on the general public to ensure that we have. This is a highly transmissible variant. We all know that, and it's the numbers are pretty significant, and we're trying to keep the transmission as low as possible on site. So, like Novak, like anyone, will be under the same conditions of testing and just safety conditions that we set up on site.
No quarantine. It doesn't need to be
There's
quarantined.
no quarantine because remember, if you're exempt, if you're under one of the conditions, you're treated the same as someone who's vaccinated, and that is federally the condition. That's not made up by tennis. Sorry. I know you're really anxious to know that, but I'll give you the wrong number. So when we need, this has just happened overnight. So when we have more information on that, we're happy to share that with you. We know the number of applicants because that's the first bit that comes in, because they contact the AO medical team, and then the application process then gets redacted, which has been explained and de-identified, and then goes through the different panels. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you.
That's very exciting.
Does anyone know when